Hey, folks. Erick Stakelbeck here. Just fixing my shot real quick. We've already got some people joining us. This is good. Whew. Been running around like a madman, as you can imagine, following all the latest developments in the Middle East right now. Thanks so much for joining us for this newscast. It is going to be good, I can promise. Although things happening in the Middle East are not very good, as we tell you often here on the Watchman Newscast. The Middle East never sleeps. This week is no exception, but to an even greater degree. Where do we begin? First of all, thank you. If you are a first-time viewer, welcome to the Watchman Newscast. My name is Erick Stakelbeck, your humble host for our live stream today. We have much to talk about. We'll probably go. Let's see, it's 4 o'clock p.m. Eastern time. We will probably go until about 5 o'clock or thereabouts. Please, let's get the live chat going. I can't always see the live chat for some reason. We'll have to work that out, the technology aspect of it. But my trusted producer, Daniel, is on the scene, and he's on it. Right now, Israel and Hamas are on the verge of a full-scale war, folks. I think it's pretty clear what's happening. This is a new escalation. That almost sounds cliched, right? Well, it's an escalation. This is a new level for Hamas in all the wrong ways in what they're doing with Israel. Let's review. Number one, at least 1,200 rockets launched over the past 48 hours alone. Over 1,200 rockets at this point. As I come to you, it's about 4 o'clock p.m. Eastern time on the East Coast of the United States, which means it's 11 o'clock p.m. in Israel right now. So I said so far only about 1,200. But folks, as you probably know now from following the situation, things have a tendency to get even nastier overnight. Once the sun goes down and nighttime comes in Israel, that's when Hamas and these terror organizations in Gaza, Iran-backed, key point there, we'll talk about that in a bit, Iran-backed terror groups led by, of course, Hamas, which rules the Gaza Strip with an iron fist, and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. These terror organizations, as I fix my shot just a little bit there. Okay, that's better. These terror organizations, when the night goes down, like the vampires they are, that's when they really get to work. So right now, as we are talking together here or spending time together here on the newscast, we might have some breaking news come in live during this live stream over the next hour. So continue to comment and join the chat. We already have over 1,000 people joining us in just 2 minutes. That is a good indicator. Keep it coming, folks. Welcome to this Watchman Newscast live stream. Okay, let me catch my breath. Whew, it's been a very long day, a very long 3 days, not only for people like I who focus on the Middle East and covering events there, but if you live in Israel. Folks, I have many friends in Israel right now who are in bomb shelters with their children as I come to you. It's 11 o'clock in Israel p.m. right now, and dear friends of mine are in bomb shelters with their children. That's the situation right now. So here's where we are. As I mentioned a minute ago, at least 1,200 rockets launched at Israel so far. I mentioned it's a new escalation. Here's why. Because in the past, Hamas obviously has targeted the Israeli communities around the Gaza Strip. We're thinking of Sderot and the kibbutzim, around beautiful communities that are based around Gaza. Sderot's only about 2 miles from Gaza, for instance. We also have seen Ashkelon and Ashdod, which are a bit north of the Gaza Strip, on the Mediterranean coast, Israel's Mediterranean coast. We have seen them hit very hard in previous engagements between Israel and Hamas. But folks, nothing like this round. Ashkelon has really borne the brunt of this Hamas rocket barrage. Beautiful city, by the way, right on the Mediterranean coast. What a view of the Mediterranean Sea. Beautiful beaches in Ashkelon. It's tragic to see this, to say the least. That's the only word I can think of off the top of my head. So number one, Ashkelon, for instance, in a 1 hour span yesterday, Tuesday, May 11th, Ashkelon was hit by 200 rockets. Folks, in 60 minutes, 200 rockets rained down on Ashkelon. That's one piece to it, why this is a new escalation. The second reason why this is uncharted territory for Israel and Hamas is that Jerusalem was targeted fairly extensively on Monday with some 7 rockets aimed at God's holy city, the ancient and ancestral capital of the state of Israel. I'll get back. I know it's not the first time that rockets have been launched at Jerusalem. I'll revisit that in a second. Let me make my last point why this is a new escalation and new ground. Tel Aviv. While southern Israel, sadly, we've seen bombarded for a decade and a half now, central Israel, in particular Tel Aviv, where some 70% of the Israeli population lives in and around that Tel Aviv metropolitan area, Tel Aviv has been hit by hundreds of rockets. Okay, how is all this different? Well, I mentioned Jerusalem. In 2014, and this is what we're seeing right now, is the biggest conflict between Israel and Hamas in 7 years. Ladies and gentlemen, the summer of 2014 was the last time that we saw such a major flare-up. And this is becoming much more than a flare-up. It may escalate into a broader war, God forbid. But in that 2014 engagement, in the summer of 2014, we saw sirens go off in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. We saw a missile launched towards Ben Gurion Airport, even a missile launched as far as Haifa, which is north of Tel Aviv on the Mediterranean coast. Haifa is the third largest city in Israel behind Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. Those were sporadic in 2014. There were kind of brief instances of rocket fire at those far-flung targets. This time around, it is steady. It is sustained rocket fire at the Tel Aviv metropolitan area and points around it in central Israel. What I'm saying to you folks is this: the theater of war, I guess you would call it, has changed. It's grown bigger. Hamas is no longer satisfied with, which is horrific enough, bombarding the communities surrounding the Gaza Strip a mile, 2 miles away, say 20, 30 miles in the case of Ashkelon or Ashdod, a little further. No. Hamas right now is showing, hey, since the last engagement in summer 2014, we have really expanded our reach and upped our game, so to speak. They have rockets that have greater distance now. These are larger rockets. Reportedly, according to people on the ground in Israel, these rockets are larger. They look different, one person said, from 2014, and they're carrying larger payloads. So greater distance, larger, more lethal payloads covering a broader geographical area. That is why this is uncharted waters for Israel and Hamas. A pipeline, by the way, an Israeli oil pipeline, was also burst into flames yesterday. The fire's under control now, but just on a side note, when you think of the carnage that has been caused here, sustained carnage. Why is it happening? Why now for Hamas? We'll get into that in a minute. I want to give you some more details, what we know right now in terms of casualties and the carnage so far. There have been, on the Israeli side, there have been several direct hits of Israeli buildings, cars. A bus near Tel Aviv was hit. It's a shell of its former self. So direct hits on apartment buildings. People have been killed. At least 6, I believe 7 actually now, Israeli civilians. One was a 6-year-old boy in the town of Sderot, about 2 miles from the Gaza border, 6 years old. He's dead. So at least 7 Israeli civilians are dead. An Israeli soldier has also been killed by an anti-tank missile launched by terrorists out of Gaza into southern Israel. So the casualties are mounting on the Israeli side, several dead and dozens wounded, and a lot of property destroyed, to say the least. So that's on the Israeli side. On the Palestinian side, as I come to you around 4:10 Eastern time on the East Coast of the United States, about 11:10 in Israel. If you're just joining us, welcome to the Watchman Newscast, a special live stream event giving you a live update on events in Israel, which we will check in a minute on my phone to see if we have any new alerts coming in. Usually, my phone over the past 72 hours, folks, has literally been blowing up, no pun intended, with these alerts constantly from the Israel Defense Forces of incoming rockets and sirens that are going off from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem to Ashkelon to Beersheba and beyond. Key point there to make: Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad today. It makes sense that these two Iran-backed and funded and supported and armed terror organizations would release a joint statement, right? Well, that's exactly what they did earlier today, threatening to reach far beyond Tel Aviv and even Jerusalem to Haifa, which I mentioned earlier, the third largest city in Israel, along Israel's northernmost coast, not far from the Lebanon border. And also they threatened Eilat. Eilat is the southernmost point in Israel. It's literally on the Red Sea. So that gives you an idea of the range and the aspirations of these terror organizations. Beersheba, I believe it's Israel's fourth largest city in the Negev desert. Obviously, biblical history there. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob all lived in Beersheba. Has also been hit pretty hard today as well. So again, expanding the reach. But I mentioned the Palestinian casualties. Some 53 at last count Palestinians have been killed in this engagement as well, folks. The Israel Defense Forces say the vast majority are Hamas terrorists or Islamic Jihad terrorists. More on that in a second, the targeting of these jihadi leaders. But the tragic thing here is twofold. Number one, I've said this on the newscast. I said it today. I said it yesterday. Hamas and Islamic Jihad quite literally use women, children, and the elderly as human shields. Folks, with no hesitation, no shame, no regard for human life, they will quite literally place women, children in front of them physically, but also they will place their rocket launchers intentionally in civilian areas because they know that the Israel Defense Forces goes to extraordinary lengths to avoid civilian casualties, to the point where the IDF will actually call ahead. Imagine this. Call ahead to the building or to civilians in the area and say, hey, please evacuate. We are targeting terrorists. That's unheard of in the annals of modern warfare. The United States did it in Afghanistan as well and Iraq, but this is unheard of. I said on yesterday's newscast, and boy, did I catch a lot of flack for this. I said that Israel and the United States today, in 2021, are the most humane fighting forces, I believe, in the history of warfare. I say that, folks, without hesitation. So you have Hamas and Islamic Jihad using civilians as human shields. Israel yesterday called off several airstrikes to avoid civilian casualties, to the point where Israeli soldiers could be killed because Israel is not targeting these Hamas and Islamic Jihad positions to avoid civilian casualties. In turn, as a result, those very targets may fire rockets or anti-tank missiles that could kill Israelis, soldiers and civilians. Yet Israel takes the high road and says, no, we're not going to do it. We're not going to compromise our values and our principles. That's one thing to keep in mind with Palestinian casualties, which are, folks, any casualty is horrific, Israeli or Palestinian. We don't want to see it. But this is what Hamas and Islamic Jihad, and by extension, the real culprit behind all of this, ladies and gentlemen, the head of the snake in Iran. This is the situation they have created. The second thing I wanted to mention about Palestinian casualties before we move on to Palestinian Hamas, Islamic Jihad terror leaders who have been eliminated over the past 2 years. Also, I said some 1,200 rockets have been launched, right, over the past 72 hours. Remember, folks, a few hundred of these rockets don't even get out of Gaza. Some of them fell in Gaza. Talk about technical workmanship and expertise on the part of these jihadis. But some of these rockets actually fell in Gaza. You could say, wow, that's really funny. But here's the horrible thing about it. When these rockets fall in Gaza, oftentimes they will kill Palestinian civilians. So Hamas and Islamic Jihad have not only the blood of Israeli civilians on their hands, Israeli soldiers as well, but Palestinian civilians, Palestinian women, children, elderly. That is on the hands of these Iran-backed terror organizations. And by the way, even before this conflict, that blood and the misery of the Palestinian people were on the heads of their leadership, Hamas and Islamic Jihad, and really in the West Bank, Judea, Samaria, as the Bible calls it, Mahmoud Abbas of the Palestinian Authority. All of them are guilty of taking the billions of dollars in international aid and not using them to feed their people, to enhance their people's quality of life, to build schools and playgrounds and hospitals and orphanages. No, they're putting them, number one, in their pockets to enrich themselves, but secondly, in the case of Hamas for sure in particular, which again rules Gaza with an iron fist. They are the governing body there. Hamas is using the vast majority of international aid that flows into Gaza to build terror tunnels and to build and purchase rockets and missiles and new advanced weaponry. And we see the bitter fruits of that right now in two ways. Number one, the Palestinian people continue to struggle horribly. And number two, we have rockets raining down on Israeli cities. So Hamas and Islamic Jihad, and again, Iran, the Iranian regime, which literally is pulling the strings. These are two Iranian proxies. They are making life miserable not only for Israelis, but for Palestinians as well. That's the real story you're not going to hear in the mainstream media. But here at the Watchman Newscast, we'll give it to you straight because this is no time to mince words. Let me take a breath. I want to talk about the targeting of those terror commanders and how Israel is fighting back here. But before I do that, we have thousands of people with us right now. Hey, God bless you guys, everyone, for joining us. Welcome. We will go for, probably about another 40 minutes or so, 45 minutes even. Keep the chat going. Right now, excuse me as I look down, I'm going to look at my phone and check in. Let's see. Daniel, my producer, says some people in the comments have been asking how they can receive alerts. It is the IDF Red Alert. You could probably just do an internet search, IDF, Israel Defense Forces Red Alert. You will get them on your phone. I also have a WhatsApp alert that I get from the Israel Defense Forces. I can't share that one with you, but the IDF Red Alert, anyone I'm pretty sure can get that. It'll be buzzing throughout the day, sadly, and overnight as well, but we need to know, right? I also want to check real quick on the latest. Bear with me as I glance down at my phone at some Middle Eastern sites. Something we want to get into is hostility, chaos in the streets of Israel, in Arab Israeli cities right now. That's a scary thing we'll talk about in a minute, folks. Hamas is promising more rocket barrages, but right now it's certainly not quiet, but we don't see what we saw around this time yesterday, which was a massive rocket barrage towards Tel Aviv. The rockets right now continue, but we don't see a barrage of some 200 or 300 right now. Thank God. Let's hope it stays that way. Perhaps Israel's response has been effective. Think about it. Yesterday, at least 3 commanders for the group Palestinian Islamic Jihad, including the head of their rocket unit, were eliminated by Israeli airstrikes. They were taken out. 3 important Islamic Jihad leaders. That's number one. Number two, Israel has struck in a major way Hamas infrastructure and military, terror, and intelligence facilities inside Gaza, including some high-rise buildings there, which were Hamas dens, I should say, of Hamas terror. Thirdly, Israel today has taken out at least 6 Hamas leaders, Hamas commanders in the military wing of Hamas. Now, all of these commanders are closely linked to a guy by the name of Mohammed Deif, D-E-I-F, Daif Def. They're closely linked to him. He is a very shadowy figure, folks. It's a name you may hear more about in the days to come. Israel has been looking to eliminate him for years now, but he has been underground. He's been moving around. He's been hidden very well there in Gaza, but some of his right-hand men were eliminated today by the Israel Defense Forces, some of the rocket and military masterminds. Perhaps we will see that in terms of, God willing, a slowdown in these rocket barrages. That is certainly the hope. So that has been part of Israel's response. Second thing to mention there, Israel's security cabinet met today, led, of course, by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the Defense Minister Benny Gantz, and they said that this operation is not over. Hamas has inflicted some serious casualties in Israel and damage and psychological terror as well. And think about it, folks. That's when it comes to terrorism, there's 2 components to it, right? There's the actual physical terror, killing, maiming people, destroying things. Then there's the psychological terror. And when you have sirens going off in your largest cities now, around the clock, which is what Israel is seeing in Tel Aviv, Jerusalem on Monday, but in particular, central Israel, Tel Aviv, it has a psychological impact. That's what Hamas wants to do. So in turn, Israel needs to impose a psychological impact upon Hamas and Islamic Jihad, and by extension, their masters in Tehran, the Iranian regime. What I'm saying is Israel needs to hit them and hit them hard and send a message. They're doing it right now. We're not sure what else is in the works, but the security cabinet in Israel did meet today. Israeli tanks have moved closer to the Gaza border. Israel certainly wants to avoid a ground incursion. In 2014, as I mentioned earlier, that was the last major round of hostilities. Israel did go into Gaza on the ground. Over 50, I believe, Israeli soldiers lost their lives in that engagement. Lasted for several weeks throughout the summer of 2014. I'll never forget it. But Israel wants to avoid that. Remember, Israel is a very tiny country, and losing 55, 58 soldiers, it's horrible in any nation. But a nation as tiny as Israel, 8 million people overall, just a little over 6 million Jews, that hurts, and it hurts hard. So Israel does want to avoid a ground incursion into Gaza, which would be serious urban guerrilla warfare, which the Israel Defense Forces are certainly trained for and well trained for and prepared for. But if you can accomplish your goals, which is to cripple the Hamas terror infrastructure and the rocket barrages, if you can accomplish that without going in on the ground, that's preferable. And we talked obviously earlier about Hamas and Islamic Jihad using innocent Palestinian civilians as human shields, women, children, the elderly. That would go to a whole other level if there was a ground engagement. You can only imagine the way shamelessly and diabolically these terrorists would use civilians as human shields, and the world will howl, and they will howl not at Hamas, they will howl, sadly, at Israel. We've seen this script many times. We'll get into that more in a minute. There's another thing I want to mention. I'm just glancing down right now at my phone. There is chaos right now in certain cities in Israel. Not only is Israel dealing with the rocket onslaught out of Gaza, the kind of chaos we saw earlier this week in Jerusalem on the Temple Mount, which really kind of kicked off, well, Hamas used that as an excuse and a pretext to begin hostilities with Israel and to start launching rockets. There's always an excuse, and terrorists from Hamas used Jerusalem and the unrest there as a pretext. But if you saw those images earlier in the week, you saw Palestinians rioting and clashing with Israeli police. It's gone to another level right now, folks. In cities like Lod in central Israel, I think of Haifa, I think of Jaffa, I think of Akko in northern Israel on the northern coast as well. Beautiful places. I've been to all of these cities. I've spent time in them. I filmed there for the Watchman TV show. These are mixed cities. What do I mean by that? Well, Israelis and Arabs live there side by side in relative peace. Over the years, coexistence, there's been great strides made in those cities. Right now, folks, that is out the window, at least for the moment. There are riots occurring in cities like Lod right now, where Arab, presumably residents of these mixed cities in Israel, are rioting. They're attacking Jews. They're attacking property. And in Lod yesterday, again, this is in central Israel, a synagogue was burned down. In Israel, a synagogue in Israel was burned down. Wrap your head around that. There was fire bombings. The mayor of Lod said this was madness, and he compared it to Kristallnacht in the late 1930s and what the Nazis did to Jewish businesses and synagogues then. That's how serious it is. Israel is dealing with the threats from without, but there is serious civil unrest racking Israel right now. As an American, sadly, I can relate to this. We've seen a lot of this rioting in the streets over the past year or so. Now Israel is getting a nasty taste of that. And folks, we do not want to see this. Obviously, Israeli leaders have called for calm. Some Arab Israeli leaders today also stepped up and called for calm. But this is a powder keg situation in these cities in Israel right now. So Israel right now is stretched pretty thin. And here's the thing about it. The Iranian regime, again, the head of the snake, sees this. They're sitting back. They're observing all of this. And what do they see? And Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, has commented on this in previous days, folks. He's talked about Israel being surrounded, obviously, by Iran's proxies, by hundreds of thousands of rockets and missiles, that ring of fire we've talked about so often here on the Watchman Newscast. He's talked about the civil unrest, clashes between Arabs and Jews, and he has talked about the political mess in Israel right now, the disunity and discord politically in Israel, where there have been 4 elections in the past 2 years alone. Hey, you thought the American political system was crazy, and we have people, thousands, tens of thousands of people from all around the world joining us right now. Welcome to the Watchman Newscast. The U.S. political system's been a little topsy-turvy over the past few years, but Israel, and I speak as an American, just sharing my own perspective living here. I know, again, we have viewers from the 4 corners of the world joining us right now live on the Watchman Newscast. But Israel, maybe a 5th election coming down the pike later this year. Could you imagine? There has just been a complete failure to form a unity government. The Iranian regime sees that. They see, and Khamenei said, Israel, and I quote, Israel is on the decline. That was his comment. They know, of course, also, and this is a key point, I believe, that the Trump administration was staunchly pro-Israel. They see what could charitably be described as daylight between the Biden White House and Israel. Iran is not stupid. They see that as well. They see that Israel's greatest friend has distanced itself from Israel in one of Israel's times of greatest need right now. Folks, a true friend is by your side through thick and thin. Right now, President Biden, up until it's around 11:30 p.m. Israel time, 4:30 p.m. here on the East Coast of the United States when I'm coming to you live here on YouTube. Up until now, President Biden has not called Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Imagine that. One of your supposedly, absolutely your greatest ally in the Middle East, and one of your greatest allies, if not your greatest ally and closest nation to you in the world, is struggling right now under the brunt of rockets and internal discord, and you don't even place a call and offer any support or encouragement. That's reportedly the situation right now. I may be wrong now. I hope I'm not dated, but last I checked, no phone call. Not only that, President Biden, in my view, as the leader of the free world, the president of the United States, usually assumes that unofficial title. And it's nice when they actually act like the free leader of the free world, because then the world is a better place. But President Biden right now has not come out with a strong, forceful condemnation of Hamas and Islamic Jihad rockets. The State Department spokesman Ned Price has made some comments. Hey, we unequivocally condemn the rockets, and that's great. In the next breath, he says, we call for de-escalation on all sides. All sides are at fault. And he equates Israel, essentially saying that, folks, he equates Israel with terrorists of Hamas and Islamic Jihad. That's the situation we have right now. What would be really nice is if the international community, quote unquote, I'm talking about the Biden White House, the European Union, the UN, if they all got together as they're busy rushing to condemn Israel and decry civilian casualties that, as we mentioned a minute ago, are mainly the fault of Hamas and other terror groups in Gaza, but they slam Israel. They call on Israel to de-escalate and back off, and they treat Hamas like little children and require nothing of them. Wouldn't it be nice instead to see a unified statement from the world community, the international community, calling on Iran to rein in their proxies, to stop the rocket fire, to call off the wolves of jihad, so to speak, and to cease firing rockets. Ladies and gentlemen, if you leave here with one thing today, leave here with this. Know this, that the moment Iran tells Hamas and Islamic Jihad to knock it off, they will knock it off. They answer to the Iranian regime, just as Hezbollah does in southern Lebanon, just as the Houthis do in Yemen, more on them in a minute, and just as these various Shia militias do in Iraq and Syria. So when the head of the snake calls off the wolves, they will stop and the rockets will stop. Clearly, Iran has not done that yet. In fact, they are looking to escalate things even further. So it would be good, considering that they are the puppet masters in Tehran, Khamenei and his regime, not the Iranian people who we love. Again, key point to all my commenters out there who say, you don't like Iran. I love the Iranian people. A rich history and culture. I look back at Persia in the Bible, Esther, Mordecai, Cyrus, amazing history, amazing people. Unfortunately, they are under the boot of a tyrannical regime. It's not the people, it's the regime. You could say that about a lot of nations right now in the Middle East and beyond, unfortunately. But this regime is calling the shots. And so the world should call Iran on the carpet and say, hey, knock it off. Call off your proxies. Call off your wolves, the wolves of jihad, as I called them. You won't see that, sadly. You won't see this on the table as these Iranian nuclear talks are ongoing. The U.S. is ready to give away the farm and re-enter this disastrous Iran nuclear deal, yet Iran's ballistic missile program not on the table. Iran's sponsorship for terror, igniting conflicts like they've done this week, not even mentioned, not on the table. My question as an American, then we'll move on just real quick. What does the United States get out of this, out of the Iran deal? Still trying to figure that out, because eventually that deal will run out. There's a sunset clause. When the sun sets in 5-10 years, Iran can do it at once. I could continue, but we need to move on to more reaction. Erdogan, the Turkish president. Now, I talked about the lack of a U.S. reaction. By the way, if you are just joining us, welcome to the Watchman Newscast live stream. We've got tens of thousands of people with us right now. Welcome. Keep the live chat going. I can't see it right now, but I'm sure it is very interesting. Got these shadows on my face, unfortunately, but what are you going to do? This is not our usual Watchman set. If you watch a newscast on a regular basis, you know that, but it can be a little tricky with the YouTube camera, everything else, to get a good frame and get a good shot. So, hey, you're here for the content anyway. You're not here for the bells and whistles. But in terms of reaction, number one, we talked about the U.S. lack of reaction. I want to talk about Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the Turkish tyrant, I call him, the leader of Turkey, the Turkish president. He, over the weekend, called Israel a terrorist state, a cruel and terrorist state, to quote him directly. Remember, this is a NATO member nation. Under Erdogan, I call them NINO, NATO in name only, but ostensibly Turkey under Erdogan is a NATO member nation. Called Israel a terrorist state, said that he will save Jerusalem. He's calling on the Muslim world to unite against Israel. Well, today, he made a very interesting phone call to Russian President Vladimir Putin. And on that call, Erdogan said that Israel needs to be taught a lesson. I'm paraphrasing, but he did say they need to be taught a lesson. They need to be deterred and basically brought down a notch. And he's calling on nations around the world, in particular the Muslim world, first and foremost, which Erdogan would like to lead as a modern-day caliph who can reign over a new Ottoman caliphate. That's his dream. That's his fantasy. Erdogan is calling for Israel to be held, to be confronted in very confrontational terms, he's speaking, and to be held accountable. Now, he had this conversation with Vladimir Putin. The Russian readout of the meeting was a bit more tame. Russia is concerned about civilian casualties, calling on all sides to de-escalate. But you see Turkey and Russia and Iran coming closer and closer together, ladies and gentlemen. For centuries, Russia, Iran, Turkey were adversaries. They were at each other's throats. Wars were fought between these nations. Now they are getting closer and closer together. Do we have any prophecy watchers out there right now who follow biblical prophecy closely like I do? You know, it was Billy Graham, the late great Billy Graham, who said, if you want to know what's going on in the world and what's coming next, you should walk around with the Bible in one hand and a newspaper in the other. Well, today it probably wouldn't be a newspaper. It would probably be one of these along with the Bible. But He was very accurate, and he continues to be today. We see Iran, Russia, and Turkey coming together in a major way. Why is that important? Well, the book of Ezekiel, chapters 38 and 39, you can check it out in your Bible if you've never read it. I hope you have. It talks about a coming war, the war of Gog and Magog. Funny names, I know, but listen for a second. It talks about a nation to the uttermost north of Israel. Look on the map. Many people believe that is Russia, leading a last days confederacy that will come against Israel. It includes Russia. Persia, which is modern day Iran, is also mentioned. Many believe Turkey will be part of this confederacy. If you look at the map and the geographical terms that are used in Ezekiel 38 and 39, that these three nations will be at the head of an invasion force that comes against Israel and that falls, is defeated on the mountains of Israel, not by Israel's hands, but by direct intervention by God Almighty. So that war has never happened. Many of the rabbis in Israel are talking about it right now and saying it could be on the horizon, the war of Gog and Magog. If you think that's crazy, realize that Israel right now is surrounded by a ring of fire, that Iran is at Israel's doorstep, that Russia is in Syria at Israel's doorstep, that Turkey is threatening, Erdogan is threatening Israel on practically a daily basis, and coming closer together with Russia and Iran. Folks, no coincidences. I don't believe in coincidences. Fasten your seatbelt. Fasten your seatbelt as we see that all playing out. So what comes next? As this continues to escalate today, Israel, again, I mentioned earlier, the Security Cabinet did meet. This is going to last for a little while, folks. It's going to last at least several days, perhaps as long as a week. The end game for Israel is to establish a permanent as can be, deterrent against these rockets. For a decade and a half, this is the fourth or fifth major engagement in the past 12 years alone. So for a decade and plus, these rockets have not only been a persistent problem and a thorn in Israel's side, it's gotten worse and worse. This isn't the longest engagement yet. It hasn't caused the greatest casualty number, thank God. But folks, in many ways, this is the most notable in that, as we mentioned earlier in the newscast, by the way, we will post it here on our archives on YouTube under newscasts. So if you missed earlier what we were sharing, you can go into our archives and you can check out the full newscast. In many ways, it is the most noteworthy in terms of Hamas is showing that they've upped their game over the past 7 years. Distance of the rockets, the size of the rockets, the payloads, the force, the lethality of the rockets, and the consistent, steady barrages. Yesterday, I mentioned earlier, 131 Hamas rockets in 5 minutes. Complete barrages, onslaughts, where they are trying to overwhelm Israel's Iron Dome missile defense system. So this is a new day. And the last thought here, well, one thought too, again, that unrest in Israeli cities really is something to be concerned about, folks. In addition to the rockets, again, those mixed cities where Israelis and Arabs in large numbers live close together, there is chaos right now and violence going on, rioting against Jews, against synagogues in some of these cities, including Lod in particular. So, folks, keep that situation in your prayers for sure. But last thought here, and I wish I didn't have these shadows on my face. I kind of hastily set up my shot here real quick. Don't worry, it'll look much better tomorrow on our usual Watchman Newscast, on our usual set. But a last thought here. This, in my view, is a bit of a dry run on the part of Iran. What do I mean by that? Obviously, Hamas is taking it further than they've ever taken it before, bombarding Tel Aviv with sustained rocket fire. Central Israel, sustained rocket fire. And at a clip, hundreds of rockets in the span of 5 minutes, at a clip unheard of. So that's one thing to think about. What I believe Iran is doing, I talked about a dry run and kind of testing the waters for the Iranian regime, which again controls Hamas. They have this ring of fire. Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza, thousands of rockets and attack drones, anti-tank missiles, all the rest. They have Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. At least 150,000 rockets and missiles pointed at every inch of Israel, which, by the way, is the size of the state of New Jersey. I don't live far from New Jersey. If you know how tiny New Jersey is, you have a good idea of what Israel is dealing with hostile borders and actors surrounding it. So you have Hezbollah with that massive, massive arsenal. You have in Syria, at Israel's doorstep, Hezbollah and the Iranian regime and various bad actors that answer to Iran that are attempting to establish a foothold there and make it an extension of Lebanon, the same situation. And precision-guided munitions, PGM for short. They do exactly what their name says. They hit their target with great accuracy and great precision. That's a game changer and a red line for Israel. That's why you've seen so many Israeli airstrikes against Iranian and Hezbollah targets in Syria over the past few years. Let's move to the east, where we have in Iraq, Shia militias that answer to Iran that have long-range rockets and missiles capable of reaching Israel. And lastly, what I've called this week in a newscast a few days ago, the new front to the deep south in Yemen, the Houthis, who are armed to the teeth, courtesy of Iran, with rockets, missiles, and yes, attack drones, which they are using with great frequency and success against Saudi Arabia. So that's the ring of fire. Now, Iran has activated one node, I guess you would say, of that ring of fire in the form of Hamas and Islamic Jihad. And what they're doing, I mentioned earlier here in this newscast, again, if you missed out earlier, if you joined us late, you can check it out in our archives right here under newscast when we're done in a little bit. Iran is a very keen observer, I would say, of what's going on in Israel. What they're doing is they're kind of sitting back and they're observing the reaction. How is Israel responding? How is the Israeli political class? How are the Israeli people? How is the Israeli military? How are they dealing with this new, kind of unprecedented escalation by Hamas? Now, folks, Hamas is one thing. They're dangerous enough, as we've seen. Hey, at least 7 people dead. We've ran it all down for you today here on this Watchman Newscast live stream. Again, we have tens of thousands of people with us. Thank you. God bless you. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe. We are bringing you Monday through Friday, every day, breaking Middle East updates. We are your one-stop shop for everything going on in the world's most chaotic and pivotal region and why it matters to you, no matter where you live. And on an encouraging note, how God Almighty is moving there, yes, now, even as all this chaos is going on. Hamas is one thing. Bad enough, huge threat. Hezbollah, ladies and gentlemen, is an entirely different level of threat, of lethality. Nightmare scenario. So Iran is saying, we'll activate Hamas. They're holding Hezbollah to fight another day. That's how I describe it. They are holding Hezbollah in reserve and preserving them to fight another day. Iran will it be this week? Who knows? Expect the unexpected in today's Middle East. My thought is that Iran wants to preserve, so to speak, Hezbollah for the day of the great battle that Iran says is dawning, where Iran feels ready to take on Israel and to activate that entire ring of fire and to go toe-to-toe with Israel. I call it the Great Northern War. Now, it's going to start to the north. Israel will be forced to face off against Hezbollah and Iran in Lebanon and Syria. But this conflict, this Great Northern War, and folks, it's a question of if, not when. That's not me saying it. It's Israeli officials and Israeli defense officials in sad voices saying we know this is coming. We don't want it, but we know it's coming and we are preparing for it. That's where it's going to start. But as you've seen this week, it's going to spread to that entire ring. Hamas and Islamic Jihad will throw their hats in the ring. Those Shia militias in Iraq will most certainly fire missiles as well. And the Houthis in Yemen, I said I'd get back to them in a second. Very interesting to see Iran and its proxies coordinating messages right now as we speak. The leader of the Houthis, Abdul Malik al-Houthi, has made some strong statements over the past few days about assisting the resistance against Israel. He's really targeting Israel right now, at least verbally. Could that be followed with rockets, missiles, and attack drones launched from Yemen by those Iran-backed Houthi rebels at Israel? Might sound crazy, but I'll tell you what, a few months ago, Israel moved an Iron Dome missile defense battery to its southernmost city of Eilat on the Red Sea in specific to defend against any potential rockets or drones launched by the Houthis in Yemen in Israel's direction. So that is what we have right now. Iran, to me, and just observing this, is testing the waters. How far can we go? How much damage can we cause? How strongly will Israel react? And how will the world react? These terror organizations can always count on the world to castigate Israel and tell Israel to back off. And meanwhile, the terror organizations don't pay many or don't have many consequences coming their way at all. It's always all sides, both sides are guilty. This cycle of violence, Israel back off. That's sadly what we've grown accustomed to, right? And these terror organizations know it, and they take full advantage of it. So rest assured, Hamas, they're masters in Tehran right now. They're sitting back. They're watching all of this unfold. They're observing this. And ladies and gentlemen, I can guarantee to you, they are taking notes right now. And I think that's the big takeaway here. We're going to wrap up in a few minutes. Stick with us. Don't leave. A few more minutes. I want to share a few more important things with you to encourage you. Imagine that. Yes. But one more scan of the headlines here before we go. As I look down at my phone, apologies, just to give you any updates and see if I got no updates from the Israel Defense Forces over the past several minutes, which is a good sign. Let's hope it stays that way, but we're approaching midnight in Israel, and this is a time, folks, historically, where things can flare up. I'm sad to say overnight in the wee hours, a lot of these rockets could fall. Hamas vowing revenge over the killing of one of their top commanders by Israel. Again, if you joined us late, Israel has eliminated at least 6 Hamas leaders and military commanders today. 6-year-old boy killed in Sderot. Still a lot of chaos in the streets in Israel, in terms of in these mixed cities where Arabs and Israelis have mostly lived together pretty peacefully over the years. Places like Lod and other places, this is becoming a real problem. It's a dangerous thing. I want to mention to you also, here we go, 5-year-old boy killed in Israel due to Hamas rockets. It continues. I want to mention a glimmer of hope for you here. Well, we know the ultimate glimmer of hope. He's more than a glimmer. His name is Jesus, and he still sits on the throne. More on that in a second. But I also wanted to mention what could be, I guess, deemed a gift from God. Iron Dome has had at least a 90% success rate, and it has shot down many of these incoming rockets. Thank God. It doesn't have obviously a 100% success rate, so some of these rockets get through. And when Hamas and Islamic Jihad try to overwhelm Iron Dome with a massive barrage of hundreds or 100 at a time, that can be tough. Even Iron Dome can't get to them all. But Israel, to my view and to my mind, has a greater friend and a greater protector, and that is the God of Israel, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, his word is very clear that he neither slumbers nor sleeps. He is the ultimate defender of Israel. You could say, well, where is he right now? He's there. He was there during the 6-day war, a miraculous victory. I don't use that word lightly. A miraculous victory by Israel. He was there in 1948 when the nation of Israel was miraculously reestablished against all odds. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to leave you with this, some words of encouragement. And we have many people, I'm sure, in the live chat. We get many commenters. They hate Israel. They hate the Jewish people, and they do not like me one bit. They don't like Christians in general. They don't like America. We get some very, very nasty comments, angry comments. Think about this. To all of my commenters, and we welcome all the comments, but to good and bad, think about this. And I leave you with this, then we'll sign off. as we approach midnight in Israel. Who ever heard of such a thing? For a people to be scattered from their ancient and ancestral homeland for 2,000 years. That's what happened. In AD 70, the Romans destroyed the Second Temple, destroyed Jerusalem. Many Jews Israelites were scattered out of the land then. Fast forward to the Bar Kokhba revolt, 132 to 135 AD. It was complete. About 1 million Jews died at the hands of the Romans in that battle, that engagement. And in the wake of the Bar Kokhba revolt, the Roman Emperor Hadrian, little history lesson for you, true history here on the Watchman Newscast. The Roman Emperor Hadrian, number one, built a pagan shrine atop the Temple Mount where the temple used to be. He called Jerusalem, renamed it, Aelia Capitolina. Imagine that. Not only that, he coined the term Palestine. Now, why did he call Israel Judea, which the Romans had conquered and smashed? They banned Jews from even entering Jerusalem at that point. Well, Palestine, Philistia, the Philistines, Israel's traditional enemy in the Bible, just to get an extra dig in it at the Jewish people, Hadrian renamed the area Philistia, Palestine, Syria, Palestina. That's where the name came from. So that's something to keep in mind. But the Jewish people were scattered for some 2,000 years. Again, who ever heard of such a thing for this people to then return to that land? 2,000 years later, against all odds, after 2,000 years of persecutions, genocide, and pogroms around the world, to return, not only that, to revive the ancient Hebrew language, which had not been used regularly for over 2,000 years, to return to this tiny nation surrounded by enemies, and to build a thriving nation against all odds, against constant onslaughts and opposition, both locally and internationally. Ladies and gentlemen, who ever heard of such a thing? You know, I was speaking at an event a few years ago, and one of the speakers said, when Israel was reborn in 1948 against all rational odds, it got a whole lot harder to be an atheist. I tend to agree with that. What I'm saying is this. The book of Genesis chapter 12, verse 3 is very clear. God tells Abraham, I will bless you and your descendants, the people of Israel, and I will curse those who curse you. Folks, history bears that out. We no longer have the Philistines. We no longer have the Babylonians. We no longer have the Assyrians, Haman, the prime minister of the mighty Persian Empire, the Romans, the Greeks, the Nazis, the Ottomans. They all are gone. They have one thing in common. They all opposed Israel and the Jewish people and persecuted them. They're now all gone. They're all in the ash heap of history. They cursed Israel. They ended up cursed. But who survives against all odds and thrives? Israel. A very unlikely story, but it's true because God Almighty, through it all, still sits on the throne. Be encouraged. Keep Israel in your prayers. Keep Jerusalem. We are mandated, Psalm 122, verse 6, to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. Pray for the Palestinians as well. Those Palestinian men, women, children, elderly who are being used and abused by their leadership and by Hamas, used as human shields, used as pawns. It's a tragic, tragic thing. Pray for the entire region while you're at it. Pray for the persecuted church in the Middle East. Pray for the United States of America, my country. We could certainly use it right now as well, and some strong leadership here. And I am praying for all of you. We can't thank you enough for joining us here on the Watchman Newscast. You can join us every day, Monday through Friday. Be sure to subscribe. You can also follow us, Facebook and Twitter. It's at Erick Stakelbeck. Instagram is at Erick.Stakelbeck. So be sure to follow us there as well. And pretty soon, we will have some exciting new announcements here on the Watchman Newscast. You're going to want to join us tomorrow for more updates. Until then, thanks so much for joining us on this Watchman live stream update. We will continue to monitor this situation closely for you until tomorrow. God bless you. And remember, never hold your peace. Take care.